Thank you for being here today. This is the keynote moment of our Constitution Week. With the generous support of the CH Foundation, we have been sponsoring a series of events to commemorate and celebrate the U.S. Constitution. Been with us since 1789. Today, we're going to be looking at that which rises above the Constitution, but also simultaneously supports it. And that's the moral basis of our civic culture. We have here today an outside speaker of great distinction, Professor William B. Allen, who has had in his time a great many distinguished positions in academia, including being dean of what is essentially the Honors College of Michigan State University, James Madison College, and who has served in a variety of public capacities as well, has been an active intellectual citizen. He was the executive director of the Virginia State Education Commission, and he was also, under President Ronald Reagan, chairman of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He's the author of quite a few books, more than I could have time to name in the short space devoted to introductions. But I might say that he's written, apropos the lecture today, 2 books on George Washington. One, George Washington, a collection of George Washington's writings, and the other, George Washington, and here's a provocative title, for some of you at least, America's First Progressive President. But it's meant to be a compliment. He's also written an important book on Uncle Tom's Cabin, looking at, I guess, the theoretical substrate of Uncle Tom's Cabin, called Rethinking Uncle Tom, the Political Philosophy of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Today's lecture, and I have one more thing to say after I give you its title, will be entitled Conscience, the Basis of Liberty, Character, and Civilization. Now, if you're in the audience today and are an undergraduate, you have the opportunity of participating in an essay competition about this lecture. In order to do that, you'll need to do it at the end of the lecture. You come up on stage and sign in, give us your name, give us your email address, and then, between now and October 1st, write a lecture of between 1,000 and 2,000 words, reacting to Professor Allen's lecture. And let us begin with it. Dr. Allen. All right.
And I have to say thank you, Dr. Bolton. Thanks to Texas Tech, CH Foundation. I've had a wonderful 2 days visiting with you. It's been highly enjoyable, in fact, so much so that I now feel myself under the obligation to repay you for the pleasure that I have known. And if I'm going to fulfill that obligation, I'm going to require your participation in the process. I need you to join me in taking a far-sighted view of the topics we're going to discuss tonight. And what I mean by a far-sighted view is what is characteristic of the rational biped. And that is to say, it is the human view. So we do want to lift our sights above everything else and to extend to the farthest reaches of human possibility. I'm well advised in taking this approach because the phenomenologist Erwin Strauss, quite some time ago, gave a very persuasive account of the rational biped and illustrated the ways in which our very form expresses our function and purpose in the universe, contrasting us with, of course, quadrupeds whose line of sight is fairly much limited to the landscape, whereas the rational biped's line of sight extends to the horizon. So I'm inviting you to look to the horizon, which I do without fear, because you're Westerners. And one thing the West boasts of is always having a clear line of sight to the horizon. That's not so easy back east, I want you to know. For back east, the the landscape is dense with things that obstruct the view, the line of sight to the horizon. So that in a way, Westerners are more profoundly human than Easterners. So yes, I do want to spend some time talking to you this evening about conscience and character and the founding of the United States. I want to put it in terms that are relevant to the life that we live, what we understand freedom to mean. For Americans increasingly define freedom in terms of individual and constituency preferences. The freedom thus targeted seems in the main to identify a right to act with immunity to social constraints as opposed to legal constraint. To be sure, legal constraints often buttress social constraints, and when that occurs, the legal constraint may become a barrier to personal choice and illegitimately entrench social constraint. The list of personal preferences, the list of personal preferences constrained by social disapprobation opens upon what has come to be recognized as identity construction. A consequence of this development is a discourse of freedom increasingly focused upon individual conduct as an exception to social expectation. And that is such a strange diminution of the concept of freedom, such a lowering or dumbing down of the idea of freedom, that it is appropriate to inquire anew into the freedom that characterized the founding of the United States. In the beginning, the Americans got it right. They did not fall for the false choice between the comfort of the least and the potential of the best, which is sometimes posed as a choice between the common good and individualism. Instead, the founders envisioned a productive people who were at the same time a caring people. They identified social progress with realizing the potential of the best. More recently, social progress tends to be identified with the comfort of the least, and that is what I call a dumbing down of the idea of freedom. As a result, our government has turned away from relying upon creative and productive individuals to advance society, and instead looks upon citizens as wards of the state, the disadvantaged, and secondly, as lucky, the advantaged. The problem is that a society can care for the least of its members only when it fosters the productivity of the best of its citizens. Our upside-down view of praiseworthy character threatens to undermine the foundation of social progress in good character, which is in an elevated idea of freedom. Now, we can appraise the chances for restoring a healthy national character by revisiting what the founders thought to be fundamental to national character. And none of those elements was more important than conscience. I'm saying conscience, not conscious. Conscience, bear in mind. George Washington, at 11 years old, copied out this: labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. And he lived by that maxim. Thus, after the new government was established, he wrote to the Baptists in Virginia, "For you doubtless remember that I have often expressed my sentiment that every man conducting himself as a good citizen and being accountable to God alone for his religious opinions ought to be protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of his own conscience." He wrote similarly to the Presbyterians, that while all men within our territories are protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of their consciences, it is rationally to be expected from them in return that they will be emulous of evincing the sanctity of their professions by the innocence of their lives and the beneficence of their actions. To the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Washington extemporized that the citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. And to the German congregation in New York, he explained that the establishment of civil and religious liberty is the motive that induced me to the field. The clear point, the goal, was not merely free expression, but social benefit. What Washington considered a wise and virtuous use of freedom of conscience was spelled out in the general orders issued to the troops at the close of the war, when, among other things for which they fought, Washington pointed out this, namely, protecting the rights of humane nature and establishing an asylum for the poor and oppressed of all nations and religions. Ultimately, therefore, the vision of self-government was a vision of a conscientious people exerting themselves with enlightened regard for the rights of others while reserving from government the prerogatives of conscience. Thus it is that James Madison in 1785 could identify conscience as the foundation of all the rights for which the revolution was waged, maintaining that the freedom of conscience is not only a right towards men, but a duty towards the Creator. This duty is precedent, this is Madison, I'm quoting, both in order of time and degree of obligation to the claims of civil society. Now, this must be what Madison had in mind when in a 1792 essay on property, he identified the first right as the property each person has in his or her conscience. Now, this commingling of property with conscience, the material with the spiritual, was neither paradoxical nor accidental. It reflected instead the settled conviction that human beings, in order to perform at the highest levels, which is to say most productively, required to enjoy the greatest possible independence compatible with social order. And within that context, they could then be counted on to act with optimum benevolence towards one another. They would first become themselves the guarantors of their own well-being, while secondly offering generous care for those in need. This is what America got right in the beginning. Political principles founded upon the assured conviction that Providence provided the necessary guidance in the form of conscience to fulfill their highest expectations for human flourishing, which Washington called the Empire of Liberty. Freedom seen in this light is uplifting, creating a social updraft, while the freedom from hunger mantra, emphasized in the 20th century, has created a social downdraft, in which freedom looks more and more like full bodies with empty souls. Beyond the superficial political and social divisions that seem to drive the narrative of freedom at the present day, there lies a deeper and perhaps unperceived source of conflict, described previously as the false choice between the comfort of the least and the potential of the best, often posed as the choice between the common good and individualism. In reality, however, the distinction amounts to opposed dispositions to see people in general as patients of caring or as agents of accomplishment or achievement. It would be fair to say that at the founding, the tendency was to identify the prospects of social advance or progress with realizing the potential of the best, that is a sense of agency, while lately, social progress has come increasingly to be identified with the comfort of the least, with dependence. That has produced a turn away from reliance upon sturdy yeomen toward cultivating citizens as wards of the state. Now, a curious illustration of this dynamic is conveyed in the much discussed inquiry pursued by Thomas Jefferson in the notes on the state of Virginia. There, Jefferson highlights in Query 14, over and above expressed bigotry and political reservations, an explicit argument about the capacity and eligibility of blacks to exert themselves sufficiently to rise to the potential of the best. He plainly meant by this to underscore what he took to be the foundation of community in the United States, which celebrated freedom and liberty. Jefferson doubted whether the Africans could benefit from freedom, and believed that only persons who could do so would qualify for citizenship. We might presume that Jefferson focused exclusively on agency and not at all on caring, but I can observe that he described sympathetically the misery of the blacks in that same query. And looking into the face of that misery in query 18, he concluded, quote, that the man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. In other words, Jefferson acknowledged that while seeking to build grace and beauty on a temple of liberty, he also recognized that his countrymen placed all at risk by aiming for the potential of the best while eschewing the comfort of the least. In reply to the suspicion that Jefferson's statements in these contexts were mere rhetorical throwaways, I suggest reading them as responses to Socratic questioning regarding the end of the polis, the end of politics. In them, Jefferson has acknowledged the good the polis aims at while disclosing its failure to uphold that good. Jefferson is a worst-case example. If the worst case testifies to the strength of the founding identification of liberty or freedom with the potential of the best, then we may with confidence elaborate the consequences and the hopeful anticipations of that view, in doing which we uncover the foundation for character as the basis of that politics. Jefferson tacitly disclosed that foundation when he described the effects of slavery upon the master as depravity. That is, Jefferson described the fatal consequences in character for what we may call Hobbesian liberty. That is, the exercise of arbitrary power over others. By reflection, therefore, we discover that the liberty Jefferson pursued was a non-Hobbesian freedom dependent upon strength of character. That is, the potential or agency of the best could only be advanced upon the grounds of such a liberty as preserved individual autonomy without admitting despotic authority over any other individual. In his historic speech to Congress on January 6, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaimed 4 freedoms as essential to democracy: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. The careful balancing of speech and worship with want and fear could not conceal the fact of a turn toward defining freedom as requiring the absence of external negative barriers. The typical example is poverty. Positive liberals believe that poverty, that is lack of money, infringes on freedom. This is the practical example of what defining freedom down means. This is the dumbing down of freedom. Roosevelt, however, did not originate the movement away from the founding meaning of freedom. The theoretical architects of that regression occupied the stage in the 19th and 20th centuries. By emphasizing the comfort of the least, this discourse abandoned the aspiration to found social progress in the potential of the best. As a result, it obscured the distinction between being a patient of caring, dependence that is, or an agent of accomplishment or achievement. This dichotomy between dependence and agency does not connote contradictions, but it does connote contraries, properly understood. Thus, they are not mutually exclusive. They are rather differentially relevant. Caring is a social value inasmuch as it is a reflection of character, but a social liability when it erodes character. The potential of the best, the exertions of the best, connotes to not any and every relative difference among human beings, but rather only differences in intelligences and character. The goal to maximize opportunities for the best intelligences and the best characters, as a definition of freedom, is precisely to enable the maximum degree of social advance overall. This difference is captured in the mutually exclusive dynamics of dependence and independence. At one end of the scale, complete dependence, there is no capacity or competence for effective agency. At the other end of the scale, complete independence, there is no contribution to a larger social purpose. Thus, it requires intelligence and character, the disposition of social responsibility to produce the social progress freedom seeks to engender. And that requires maximizing, not merely optimizing, the number of persons who can act with effective agency while minimizing the number of persons sunk in complete dependence. In this light, it is clear that education, rightly conducted, is the most efficient instrument for the reallocation of social values, that is, the redistribution of social values, or social capital. By rightly conducted, I mean that education that induces as great independence and as little dependence as possible. That is the education of agency, as opposed to the education of victimhood. We see concrete evidence of this in the environment of contemporary healthcare, where practitioners now routinely recognize the importance of engaging patients in the decision-making regarding their course of treatment. The turn toward emphasizing the comfort of the lease as the essence of freedom accordingly has resulted in disabling the necessary social resources required to sustain social progress. Do the citizens of the United States truly form one people? Should they form one people? Or stated another way, can a group of people be considered one people if they do not share the most fundamental of principles and views about right and justice? Or is it acceptable, perhaps beneficial, that the citizenry is fundamentally pluralistic and diverse, having no fundamentally shared views in common? They can believe that all regimes are guided by a central idea, a shared view of justice that makes a people a people. This was a very old idea, one expressed by Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Aquinas, and even Jefferson. But this does not mean that we have not outgrown the idea. We must question whether a democracy without shared fundamental principles can long endure. To this end, the practical question of what today unites us, what today divides us, deserves an urgent response. One scholar offered a response, I quote, "Beyond membership and reciprocity, further conditions apply to Republican citizenship. The ideal of the Respublica includes a high degree of participation on the part of its members. The Republican citizen does not passively submit to imposed rule, but actively participates in constructing and maintaining the Commonwealth, perhaps on an unequal footing, perhaps through representation, or even a monarchical leader or aristocratic body, but in any case not as a mere subject. In the Republic, each citizen can appeal to laws that shield him from arbitrary rule, and each has a sense of ownership in the community." Now, as comprehensive as that view sounds, it nevertheless does not succeed in finding a foundation of citizenship beyond the positive construction of the polity. I mean by that it is only the existence of the state first that enables the definition of citizenship as thus provided. And what we're looking for is the foundation of citizenship before politics, prior to the state. So, Professor Peterson sustains the idea, in effect, that citizenship derives from community, rather than the reverse. Whereas I now maintain that it is only citizenship that is the moral and pre-political foundations of citizenship that is generative. The resulting common good is the offspring rather than the mother of moral seriousness. It was for a similar reason, no doubt, that Aristotle identified the nameless virtue in his ethics as crucial in the formation of community. We seek, therefore, a recovery of moral seriousness sufficient to found a commonwealth. And that raises the question, therefore, of statesmanship. Statesmanship knows no partisan calling. And even its patriotic calling is tempered by the dedication to justice and not to honor. In the American political tradition, there are essentially two very different models of statesmanship, presenting conflicting models of leadership and public service. These differing, even rival notions of politics and public service reflect differing, even rival conceptions of democracy and popular self-government. In a word, democracy balances between the dynamics of rival interested combinations on the one hand and the dynamics of a society privileging the rule of law above the claims of interest on the other hand. The former is democracy defined as mere majority rule, while the latter is democracy defined as just majority rule. In October 1785, James Madison launched a local political campaign that had world historical significance. He initiated a public petition in protest of a draft religious assessment statute pending in the Virginia General Assembly. In raising such a protest, Madison established no precedent. He was in fact following a path well worn by American colonists in their petitions to king and parliament in the pre-revolutionary years, nor were the democratic implications of the procedure path-breaking in the aftermath of the Declaration of Independence and state constitutional conventions. What was of world historical significance was making clear and explicit the radical ground of modern politics, going beyond the literary and philosophical tropes of earlier versions. Madison's protest is known under the title Memorial and Remonstrance. In it, he declared roundly that the religion, then, of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. And it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. The right is in its nature an unalienable right. It is unalienable because the opinions of men, depending only on the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men. It is unalienable also because what is here a right towards men is a duty towards the Creator. It is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage, and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This duty, and this is the point that requires emphasis, this duty is precedent both in order of time and degree of obligation to the claims of civil society. In its generalities, this argument resembles very strongly the language in Thomas Jefferson's draft statute of religious liberty for Virginia, which had been pending since 1784 and which Madison would ultimately shepherd into law after killing the proposed religious assessment bill. But Jefferson's focus on the priority of reason and nature to the claims of religion bore an altogether different weight than Madison's focus upon duties precedent to the demands of civil society. By insisting upon conviction and conscience as independent ground for determining conduct, Madison went beyond safeguarding religious opinion and erected a compulsory force acting in the sensible world from a transcendent vantage. Madison's language may have departed from the standard that Jefferson embraced, but it was neither new nor unrelated to Jefferson's position, for well before his memorial and remonstrance, Madison had already staked out the ground he would occupy in a concern that he shared with Jefferson. And he signaled this by quoting himself in the memorial when he referred to the equal title to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. Now, in doing that, the quotation from Article 16 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights reflected Madison's contribution to George Mason's draft of that document. In it, Madison was acting in agreement with Jefferson in fending off Mason's draft language, which had spoken of religious toleration. The scholar Eva Brown describes this at some length in an article on memorial and remonstrance, and the critical point of her account is that that word toleration implies not a right to religious liberty, but a privilege granted. That was absolutely insufferable to Madison. So we're seeing a transition take place. And it is of particular interest not only that Madison and Jefferson found toleration in principle objectionable, but that Madison incorporated Jefferson's reason and conviction before closing with the dictates of conscience. And that was Madison's own contribution. So as Brand suggested, this aimed to end religious establishment. But it did more. It identified the faculties of reason and of conscience as equally involved, knowing that the faculty of conscience, if there be such a faculty, was a faculty beyond reason. Now this is the point that most interests us. Namely, is there a distinguishable human faculty called conscience? And if so, of what sort is it? How is it distinguished from reason? Is it resolvable into subjective preference, as reason can be? Is it an active human power, as reason is? Or is it a passive human power? The answers to these questions mean everything. For if the obligations of conscience are prior to the obligations of civil society, then they operate with a compulsory force that limits the efforts of human lawmaking. So, I want to underscore the problem I'm considering. Are humans subject to an authority over which they exercise no will or choice? And is that authority of such nature that it can operate upon the sensible world in which human agency acts with resort to voluntary initiative? If the answer to these questions is yes, if conscience can guide human conduct no less surely and still more eminently than can human choice, whether from appetite or reason, then it must follow that humans are as much moved as movers in the moral universe. Because that is so, it must also follow that they act upon the sensible universe without first being acted upon by the sensible universe. That is to say, it is not merely material determinism. That is, within the localized realm of the sensible universe, humans are unmoved movers. They make things happen on their own initiative. The unmoved mover, of course, is Aristotle's account of the source of all motion. It has been taken to parallel the force of God creating ex nihilo. In short, the idea of conscience instantiates the power of God in the sensible world, localized or domesticated through man. And nothing is more important than to inquire whether humans are thus moved. Now, the first approach in rendering conscience is to identify the source that Madison identified, God, as the agent acting through this human faculty. It is important to observe, however, that in doing this a further question arises, namely, in what way God's teachings or commands manifest in human beings. For if it is irresistible, then the reality of conscience would not be politically relevant, inasmuch as there would be no human acts, including the actions of civil society, out of conformity. In much the same way that animal nature in general does not resist to instinct. That is to say, the fact that this is true is further suggested by the history of God's teaching. For under the old or original covenant, God addressed men in general, but only through specified human agents. I mean by that revelation was conveyed to particular persons who bore the burden of representing it to the rest of mankind, or Israel. So pronounced was this effect that the people of Israel themselves recognized that they could not interact directly with God and needed Moses as an intercessor. This reality is underscored by the need for prophecy in general. God's original plan of communication with man did not seem to rely upon a distinctive human faculty to discern his commands. Conscience, as the means of communication from God to humans, is a successive faculty to the age of prophecy. Now, this makes our inquiry even more complicated, and I'm going to have to foreshorten it, but we'll have time to talk. Because it implies that we cannot derive conscience from an inquiry into human nature, at least not without entertaining the idea of plural natures. On the first premise that conscience is not natural, we must read Madison's claim that the duty is precedent both in order and time and degree of obligation to the claims of civil society as reflecting divine intervention in the created order, with the specific purpose of disposing man to suffer divine command, and therefore its passive character. On the second premise, human beings grow a second nature that radically transforms their status in a sensible order. It is important to observe that conscience is not seen as reshaping the sensible order. It is only seen as directing some of man's conduct within that order, while leaving the balance of that conduct to be sorted on natural grounds. The difference in the premises is only the extent to which we find clarity in understanding conscience from psychology or from religious faith. Now, there are many illustrations of the power of this line of reasoning. Some are manifest in the works of Abraham Lincoln. He it is, of course, who, in a letter to Henry Pierce in 1859, described the world as a world of compensations. He said that he who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it. God's justice, Lincoln suggests, does not displace human responsibility, but builds in reciprocating principles that prevent the ultimate overturning of divine commandments. This argues implicitly that humans make judgments and undertake actions that interact with God's teaching in such a way as sometimes to contravene, but never to overturn that teaching. That implies further that human effort to achieve or realize divine command may equally be the result of human initiative or of divine initiative. Since these two factors operate independently, their coordination or lack thereof is critical to determining how we are to understand the role of conscience. For since conscience is absolute, final in its determinations, whereas reason is fungible, subject to change or exchange, the potential for variance in their determinations is very large. Thus, at the very least, and at the very heart of political foundation, lies the question of whether the fundamental principle guiding that foundation follows or does not follow the direction of conscience rather than reason. When Lincoln continued in the letter to Pierce to identify the principle of equality as central to the founding, he meant to elaborate the idea that slavery contravened God's justice. And he said, all honor to Jefferson, the man who in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a really revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men at all times. The abstract truth of equality and its derivative consent derives from the laws of nature of nature's God. Insofar as God speaks through nature, God necessarily speaks abstractly. Thus, Lincoln's observation may be reduced to the idea that Jefferson had the forecast to introduce a rational principle into the Declaration, as opposed to circumstantial preferences. But the human capacity to live up to the standard of rational principles is contingent, first, upon their rational faculties, and second, upon the extent of their submission to reason. Since reason is not a passive faculty, in other words, it remains an open question whether its authority will be conceded. To Socrates, when abstract principle is apodeictic, it is ethically as well as intellectually compulsory. That in turn reduces questions of justice to questions of knowledge or ignorance, and there's no room left for an independent moral agency such as conscience. Foreshortening the inquiry, what I'm pointing to is how problematic is the idea of conscience as a human faculty. Now, it is the case that Spinoza and Kant both provide some metaphysical direction towards understanding conscience as a faculty. But the point I'm now concerned with is to engage you in reflecting upon this reality, that if there is a conscience, and it is a distinct human faculty from reason, and it is not merely a sense of social consensus or an expression of common mores somehow subjectively experienced, then it needs an account. And I will submit to you that we cannot find such an account anywhere other than in the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so, at some length, I present an argument which shows the recurrence to the term conscience in the New Testament, which is a neologism in that context. The term does not appear in the Old Testament at all. And I point to those passages in the New Testament, which all elaborate the one passage which says everything that James Madison conveyed in the Memorial and Remonstrance, and that's Acts 5:29, and there said we ought to obey God rather than men. Now, we find in the tradition, the theologian Fenelon, for example, the French theologian, introduced this idea of conscience in these terms. First of all, as an instrument to resist the human authority of the church. In doing so, however, what Fenelon accomplished was, of course, first of all, to insert a wedge between the church and the state. For all the authority claimed by the state descended still at that time from the authority of the church, the authority of religion. So once conscience was established as a faculty to which to appeal, to lessen the authority of the human hierarchy in the church, it could not help but subsequently also to undermine the authority of human beings in the state, in government. This thing called conscience, to which the Americans appeal, is the sort of thing that forces us to ask whether indeed there is any conscience apart from that conscience which is inherited from the teachings of the New Testament. Whether the obligation to obey God is the obligation to follow the conscience informed by God's advocate. In the New Testament, Jesus Christ speaks of leaving an advocate, leaving the Holy Spirit, Comforter, the Holy Ghost, whatever the particular version of that is. And its relationship to the question of conscience is this. For those works also speak of this faculty being purged by Christ. That is to say, previously, human beings had the faculty, which we know because the Lord, walking in the garden, asked of Adam and Eve, "Who told you you were naked?" pointing to the conscience. But that conscience, before receiving this direct support under the revelation of Christ, did not operate with compulsory force. Human beings could act inconsistently with it because they did not perceive its guidance in a compulsory manner. So what Christ says is, I'm purging the conscience of its indifference to good and bad. So it was there, the direction was provided, but not attended to. So I'm purging that so that it will now operate to provide sure guidance. This does not mean automatically that the human being will follow conscience. It does mean that conscience never fails the human being under that presentation. Now, what is my point? My point is, this is what James Madison is pointing to in the Memorial and Remonstrance. This is what George Washington is pointing to in his numerous passages invoking exactly the same principle as the underlying foundation of self-government, of republicanism. Our claims, our moral claims, come before our obligations to the state. And they cannot be overridden by the state on that foundation. That means, therefore, we cannot point to fundamental human rights as some kind of legislative or judicial decision. That is not where we discover them. It also means this, that there is a sense of liberty that is conveyed, which means fundamentally sovereignty. The sovereignty that James Wilson identified in 1787 after the Constitutional Convention closed as residing entirely in the people and not in the people's representatives. Now, this question of American liberty, we're saying, is somewhat at stake today. And one example of why it's at risk, why it's at stake, is that we have what I would call the arising of moral frontiers in which we face choices, and the way we decide to go at these forks in the road will tell everything about the future of liberty. And so we are asking ourselves a single question: whether the clear view articulated at the founding can see us through the ups and downs of American history. Can it see us through the era of moral or cultural disintegration, which many of us think we now observe? To some, the upsurge in cultural variation is critical. Samuel P. Huntington counted it as posing the potential end of American history. He meant that national character has undergone irreversible changes under the pressure to integrate widely varying cultural perspectives. But is that so? It is easy to mistake a moment of trenchant political or policy decision in which compromises the essence of prudential management with an inflection point in which adherence to an absolute moral criterion is essential. It seems rather that what would mortally injure American liberty would be such an inflection point as one in which citizens surrendered fundamental moral principle instead of resisting its abandonment. To that end, moral persuasion remains the fundamental tool, and wise statesmanship remains the best hope. Our crisis, and I think we do have a crisis today, results from the fact that we hold but loosely to the character of Republicans. That character counts liberty as its chief goal, subordinating the ups and downs of policy initiatives to the overriding importance of self-government. If we experience political disorder today, it results most assuredly from an increasing unwillingness to abide the outcomes of Republican processes as binding our consciences. Think of resistance. That is true of the struggles of contending interest. The issues that divide us do so not as the momentary victories or disappointments of politics, but as the life or death political verdicts or verdicts of political maneuvering. Thus, it does not suffice to establish equal laws applying uniformly to all. The game is to assure protected privileges for the prevailing parties, the winner of what is merely a game. Our politics have attained a winner-take-all orientation that is dismissive of alternative options. In that sense, we become enemies instead of fellows mutually embarked on a vessel whose safe voyage is of ultimate advantage to us all. Despite the obvious reality that zero-sum politics finally mean everyone loses, that has become the character of our political transactions. There are many issues that divide us that are insusceptible to compromise. These and other intractable oppositions, however, are resolvable on higher grounds of republicanism. For republicanism begins with the principle that the role of government is subject to the rule of the citizen rather than the reverse. What is the rule of the citizen? It is to superintend the exercise of legislative authority and the administration of the laws. Public opinion, not as the ephemeral reflection of daily polling, but as the settled expression of majority sentiment, is the vehicle through which this superintendence takes place. James Madison established the standard at the outset of writing of the Constitution when he said, "Public opinion sets bounds to every government and is the real sovereign in every free one. As there are cases where the public opinion must be obeyed by the government, so there are cases where not being fixed, it may be influenced by the government." Madison's argument is carefully balanced, establishing the authority of public opinion while nonetheless making room for displays of statesmanship that can shape public opinion. The sort of shaping that we saw in Abraham Lincoln's actions and his speeches. So we face today the task of trying to recover national character, and we ask, what will it take to revive national character? First and last, the citizen's voice must be heard and heeded. The coercion of the law is not a substitute for moral commitment. Accordingly, efforts to give voice to the will of the people are above all efforts to render coherent a clear public philosophy. To sum up that public philosophy in terms that would still have been recognizable in the 18th century, government in the United States is subject to the will of the people. Government independent of the will of the people is but a form of despotism, however disguised it may be by the forms of representation. At the heart of our public life, there lies always the revolution principle. Republican life is possible only where the citizens are Republicans. Now, I think you get the gist of what I'm saying. We're talking about the inevitable influence of good government and good laws upon the people subject to them. That is what republicanism is about. At the origins of this nation, it was expected that such influences would triumph over differences of interest, religion, economics, geography, and cultural values. That such expectations were justified seems vindicated by the experience of Americans for nearly 2 centuries under the Constitution. That we have strayed far from them in more recent times seems no less certain. Before our Constitution can regain its authority in our lives, it must regain its authority in our souls, and it falls to us to exert ourselves to make that possible. Otherwise, our Constitution, mistakenly called a living Constitution by those who contributed to our straying, would be but a dead letter.